Well, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed Dope as Death. I am so excited. I really enjoyed Dope as Death. So I'm so excited to have this conversation with Mia and to explore some of the things that you saw in the film. So Mia, I loved Dope as Death for like so many reasons. And one, it's where I grew up. I grew up in Westchester, which is about 45 minutes north of the South Bronx. It's where I grew up, and it's when I grew up. I was born in 1970, so and my parents, no one was a Panther, but my parents were activists. And my mother worked for something called the Community Action Project or the Community Action Program in Westchester. And I'm so sad that she is not here today so that I can ask her about the Lincoln Hospital takeover and all of those things, because I'm certain that was part of her vernacular and she could have filled in the blanks for me. And two, this is the work I do. I am a family physician and an addiction physician, addiction medicine physician, and I spent a good bit of the last couple of years introducing AccuDetox to some of the clinics where I work and in the communities where I work in Northern Colorado. So I was on the edge of my seat when someone sent, maybe it was you, Whitney, I'm not sure, who sent me an email saying, would you do a Q&A for the director of Dope as Death? And I'm like, oh, sure, why not? Dope as Death. I look it up and I'm like, oh my God, AccuDetox in 1973? What? This is fantastic. So anyway, sorry, you're supposed to do all the talking, but I just wanted to tell you all the reasons that I was so excited about your movie.
Well, I mean, I'm so flattered that you like the film, having it being so close to where you grew up. You know, I grew up in Montreal, so in Canada, so it was a whole different thing. But for myself, I first learned about the story through Mario Wexu, who was the acupuncture teacher who taught these activists, the members of the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, acupuncture in the early 70s, mid 70s. And I met Mario through his daughter. So that was my entry point to this history. And also on a personal level, I had a stepbrother who's been on and off of methadone for 30 years. So I was so interested to hear about acupuncture to treat withdrawal symptoms and the political education that they were doing. And
absolutely.
Everything was just super fascinating to me. So
that I love that part of how you became interested in this and your personal attachment and personal connection to this. So I've also heard you say, Mia, in some of the interviews that I have watched, that you really like a counter narrative.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, as I watched the film, I sort of said to myself, what is this film about? And I wonder if you would respond to and give me your thoughts. I think this film is about a lot of things. It's about Mutulu and this group of absolute revolutionaries in the late 60s and early 70s. It's about and how they were sort of hunted and sort of, run out of town, literally. It's about the intersection between racism, substance use, healthcare, equity, and justice. It's about the empathetic treatment of substance use disorder. It's about AccuDetox. There's a lot of learning about AccuDetox and acupuncture. It's about methadone as an arm of or a form of oppression, which I thought was fascinating. And it's a little bit about one of the ingredients that created one of the most talented artists of our time, in Tupac Shakur. I wonder how you respond to that litany of what is this film about?
Yeah, it's always it's about all of those things. It's always hard to sum up because I feel like I have, depending on who I'm talking to, I might say, oh, this is a film about, that contextualizes the work of Dr. Mutulu Shakur and understanding why he's a political prisoner, and then the history of accessible healthcare and racism in institutional healthcare and education. But I think for this idea of counter narrative, when I first started corresponding with Mutulu and learning about, his community work and him, it was a collective of people, but him being this person who had wanted to bring acupuncture to the community as a form of self-determination. And then you Google his name, and he's a criminal, of somebody who was on the FBI's most wanted list. And in some journalism of, looking at Mutulu's case, like the medicine they were doing is just sort of like an aftermath, or they don't really, it's like it's his narrative as a criminal has delegitimized this whole history, that this work that they've done. So to me, that was just like, really just seems so unfair and, upsetting. And so there's that aspect of like counter narrative, and also just like not questioning, like a lot of people don't question methadone, or they don't understand the other side of, or they're not sensitive to how this could be viewed as a form of control, or, maybe not necessarily, like just not the healthiest solution, or this idea that there are other solutions to addiction that maybe for whatever reason we don't explore as much. So, I mean, there's so many different things.
Yeah, no, I just love, and I really feel like, Dope is Death could not be released at a better time. I mean, we just couldn't be talking about this film in a more appropriate context. And I think that Dope is Death is, if you zoom way out, right, it's about equity, right? It's about, how do we understand substance use, right? I loved the scenes in the movie of the young men of color nodding off on the streets of the South Bronx, because there's one lens through which to look at that really is satisfying for a large majority of our population. This is lack of personal responsibility. This is people making choices in their life. This is fill in the blank. But if you adjust that lens, right? If you adjust that lens in the way that the Panthers were trying to do, it is about how is it, asking those questions. How is it that these individuals ended up on this street corner? How is it that these individuals have made some choices around using substances, and what are the hurts and what are the traumas that they are trying to manage? I love all of that about this film.
That was something that having with my stepbrother Matthew, I remember as a teenager going to family group therapy, talk therapy. He was in a 12-step program, and even when I was 14, I thought it was so unfair the way that the guidance counselors was telling us that we can never trust Matthew ever again.
Absolutely.
Because he had all these teenagers that were there with their families had broken this trust and can never be trusted again. And I was like, it just seems so like intense. Like, and I later we found out more about what he had gone through as a kid with abuse, and there's always so much more. And this idea that even with this, just like what is public health? Like, what's a public health issue? Like, is addiction a public health issue or a criminal issue? And one of the women, Uria wanted Trinidad, who was a part of the Lincoln Detox, and a young lord, she talks about how she continued to work in addiction services after the Lincoln Detox was shut down, and had experienced this shift of like when the political education classes that they were doing there in the 70s, they tried to put the lens on environmental and systematic, the cultural situation that could lead to addiction, so that the responsibility isn't just on the individual. It's like, we live in this society that, we're treated as, we're not valued the same way as the white students in school with history or whatever, like there's just so many different levels. And how after 1985, she had to work in that she had to keep everything shifted to the individual in the therapy, and how difficult that was for her to, and then she, she just ended up having to do other work.
Yeah,
yeah.
I absolutely loved that about this film. The very present, the very presence in the treatment plan for this population is AccuDetox. It's love, it's touch, but it is also political education. I loved those PE classes, and it is about empowerment. It is about questioning the narrative around why people say you ended up where you were. And I very much heard that as the program moved from that got closed in the South Bronx and then moved to Harlem, and that young woman talking about the very palpable change in the program without that element.
Yeah, I think Juan Cortez, who works at NYRA in New York, he's always saying that they can't be political. So but they still are very political, because they're involved in political actions in the city, but they can't actually provide that kind of therapy, they're like that, the same approach as before. And some people will say that that's why the Lincoln Detox was shut down, because they were too political. And it was, not some people, I believe that's why they were shut down, because I think that the Lincoln Detox existed at a very unique time in history, because it was the 70s. They were able to there was more funding and for community involvement in programs. But then, by the end of the 70s, they were seen as too threatening. So now a lot of, just because of the radical politics, the association with some quote unquote domestic terrorism, or organizations that could be viewed that way, where today these programs exist with such barely any funding at all. And they have to really kind of stay on this kind of apolitical spectrum.
Yeah.
And so it's a whole different thing, but the services are so needed by the population. So people like Juan, they're really, they work so hard to keep these programs going so people can get this treatment.
Absolutely. And I just couldn't help but think about one of my favorite scenes is Juan and his team doing AccuDetox on the street at a table in front of a bunch of storefronts. I just thought that was just a fantastic visual. But it's hard not to think about that change in the substance of the program in light of recent direction to stop talking about aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I mean, there's just such parallels between helping people understand and question the narrative around how they ended up where they are. Why do I live in this zip code? Why does my zip code not have adequate schools? Why does my zip code not have adequate hospitals? Why does one hospital serve tens of thousands of people, where in another zip code it looks different? And the inability or the stifling around talking about that, what that means, and how the inclusion of that created this incredible program at the Lincoln Detox.
Yeah, I think the statistics were at the time when the activists literally took over the Lincoln Detox, the Lincoln Hospital, to provide this service among other services for the community. There was one doctor for approximately 4,500 residents in the South Bronx.
Wow.
And compared to Westchester County, which was the statistic, I think 1 to 100. So that was that information at that time. That's huge. Shocking. This was a time when New York was almost was approaching bankruptcy, and services were just cut in these in neighborhoods like the South Bronx. And it was, you know, the Lincoln Hospital, children were getting lead paint poisoning. There was rats. It was filthy. You know, like they were understaffed. Nobody spoke Spanish. It was a predominantly Spanish-speaking neighborhood. So this is all the things that, these are all the issues that mobilize these 19 and 20-year-olds. Like these were teenagers, basically, who took this upon themselves to do something, to provide fair and just accessible, very basic healthcare to people.
And another thing I love is your ability and how you showcase just how incredibly thoughtful and progressive and innovative these very young people were.
Yeah.
One of my favorite scenes in the movie is, I think it's Juan Gonzalez. I think he's a young lord, and he is talking about armed aggression or armed. I can't remember what he calls it. But he says, yes, that's one way to view it. But another way to view violence is through the violence that we experience every day as poor people in this community. And I wonder if you would talk about, you know, kind of what you learned through that.
Yeah, like for that was a very young Juan Gonzalez from Democracy Now! And he was talking about how the violence that they experienced every day was having no hot water, having no health care, having, living in buildings that were falling apart and having no, just having like no services, and going to a hospital where you're going to be where the chances of you being mistreated are very high. Mm-hmm. And there's a path that consistently mistreats people. And to me, that is like what was so interesting, speaking to people like Juan Gonzalez, Felipe, Luciano, Cleo Silvers, because when they first started organizing politically, they were very idealistic and they wanted to really, they're very revolutionary. And then when they started asking people in the community what they wanted, it was basic things like, mm-hmm. They wanted garbage to be picked up. They wanted just like very simple, basic things. So they wanted to be able to go to the hospital and be understood, like, to have an ability to speak in Spanish and be understood by doctors. Like it was, so they really shifted their activism to very localized day-to-day things. Like the situation with garbage in 1970 in New York was horrible. Like as soon mm-hmm. as you got above Upper East Side, the garbage was apparently there for months and nobody would come and pick it up. So they like staged a garbage offensive where they put all the garbage in the street and lit it on fire. And, they also hijacked a X-ray truck that was in Manhattan, but wasn't going above, 110th Street, and to test people for TB, which was a huge issue then. And so they had taken over this X-ray truck, and the technicians ended up going they recruited the technicians to be on their side. So they were able to.
That's fantastic.
So they did all these things that, if you read Joanna Fernandez's book, The Young Lords, A Radical History, she covers this whole history so thoroughly. It's so, it was just published at the same time as the documentary came out. There's so many stories like this that they did leading up to the hospital and the Lincoln detox. Right. So the healthcare, all within 1 year. I think they started this in 1969, and they just got so involved. It's really, it's incredible. And to this day, when you go into a hospital in New York, there's the Bill of Rights for patients, which they started, which comes from them.
That's fantastic.
So it's really inspiring, and it's still it
lives on, it endures.
Yeah, exactly.
That's fantastic. I loved the image of that complaint table at the at the entrance of the Lincoln Hospital, and your storytelling around, these complaints that just weren't getting heard.
Yeah, and that started with Cleo going door to door before that. Cleo Silvers, who was both a former Black Panther and Young Lord,
Mm-hmm.
and then they had 2,000 complaints from that table, including lack of drug treatment, which is obviously the theme of the film is focusing more on the drug addiction, which there was one program for methadone at Lincoln Hospital that had about 100 outpatients a day.
Mm-hmm.
But or maybe just 100 people in the program at one time. Got it. There was they were already very suspicious of methadone because it was methadone maintenance. So they knew that there needed to be treatment for the people of the South Bronx, and they knew that they didn't want to keep everyone on methadone maintenance for an indefinite amount of time, but they also needed, they could only have the clinic run if they, in the beginning, if they offered methadone, because it was a program. That was the only thing that the state was really recognizing.
Got it.
So they did a methadone detox in the beginning, which was 10 days.
Got it.
Of methadone. And then once they were able to discover acupuncture, bring that in, they realized that, because people were getting so nervous towards the end of the 10 days. And then they were able to like really continue to ease. At the beginning, it was just like, let's see if this can help ease people's withdrawal symptoms, so they could just make that extra step to get off. Right. And it was so much more effective than they thought, than they anticipated. So then they started eventually just using the acupuncture to detox people. And that's another reason. That's also when they started to have problems with the state keeping the clinic running, because they're like, you're not giving methadone. What are you doing? Right.
So I wonder if you would talk about that. There was so much more at the end of the film. I was like, there's so much more I want to know about what happened. So I wonder, can you talk about kind of that transition from, because I gather that there was a little bit of a honeymoon period here where people felt like, wow, we got what we asked for. And it's just amazing that they took that hospital in 15 minutes, hung the Puerto Rican flag by noon, and had their demands met within a reasonably short period of time. And so can you talk about sort of the transition between this is working well, we are serving our community, to, trouble brewing, and the closure of that program and moving to Harlem?
Yeah, I'm not 100% clear on every step, because everybody has their own version. And my feeling is that everyone was so busy that was part of this group that it was only open for 9 years, and it was a very busy 9 years. But there was, up until 1975, I would say almost 100% of the patients were doing methadone and then the acupuncture.
Okay.
And then once the acupuncture...
And was it sort of short order methadone into the acupuncture?
It was a 10-day... I think it depended. I'm not sure, but my understanding is that, because not everybody was comfortable with acupuncture in the beginning. Okay. Because it was very unknown. People didn't really understand what it was. So...
Yeah, I can't remember who it was, but he was the gentleman who's now an acupuncture deliverer, who was like, I walked in and they're sticking needles in people, and he's like, I got to get up out of here. This is not okay. But I stayed.
Yeah, like it was really, now everybody knows acupuncture, but back then, I think it was in 1971 when America started to go to China. It was very, very new then. So people were a little nervous about it. And, but then more people started to do it. They would do community acupuncture. So it was in a room. So people would start seeing other people receiving this treatment, and then they would want to try it. And then people started to come in and say that they didn't want the methadone because they had been through methadone so many times and they just wanted the acupuncture. Got it. And that started to happen more and more. And then Matulu was so, they were all very, very opposed to methadone. They didn't like disposing methadone at all, but they had, it was just, that was kind of the standard treatment.
Sure,
So that once
sure.
my understanding is then they started to dissuade people more and more from taking the methadone. And then the hospital administration started to become more and more skeptical, because they were like accusing them of fraud. They started to really get on their case, like, if you're not using methadone, what are you doing?
Right.
And
right,
then
right.
some, even Chuck Schumer was a assemblyman at that time, and he accused them of being a ripoff program and of indoctrinating people into radical political ideology. So there was a lot of things going on that kind of got messy.
More
and
counter narrative.
Yeah, the counter narrative. So then by 1978, was it? Yeah, November 1978. I'm sorry, I was like, is it 97?
That's okay.
They had completely shut it down based on this. They basically said that they weren't carrying out real medicine there.
Right.
So they defunded the program.
Got it. And that's when the move to Harlem took place.
Yes. But when they moved to Harlem, it was when Dr. Shakur set up the Black Acupuncture Advisory Association of North America at the Harlem Institute. That was 100% private clinic, whereas the Lincoln Detox was city and state funded. So everything changed at that point. It was less accessible to people. They had to run it themselves. So it became more of a private clinic. So it was just harder to sustain without that.
So I wonder, Mia, we've gotten the warning. But I wonder if you would talk just a little bit about what I have just a couple more questions for you. What does life look like now for opioid use disorder in the South Bronx and in Harlem? What does that look like? Can you talk about is it the New York harm reduction educators? Yes. Where Juan is working?
Yeah. Well, since COVID, I've spoke to him a few times, and they're having a really hard time reaching people and helping people. He was doing Zoom calls with people to show them how to do their own pressure points on their ear, and with breathing, and doing Tai Chi classes.
Nice.
But I will say my experience the first time I went to the clinic in Harlem, the drop-in clinic, I wasn't skeptical. I wasn't sure, I was still questioning how effective it was, more in the sense of, was it mostly the acupuncture? Was it the political education classes? Was it a combination?
Sure.
But the first time, Juan let me just sit in the room with him for a day, and people would come in and they'd be kind of agitated and stressed out and kind of like, looking very withdrawn, and they would sit down and Juan would put the needles in, and always like within 5 or 10 minutes, you would see people just totally relax.
Right.
And then we'd start talking, and it's just like, it was really beautiful the first time I was there, because I really kind of understood more viscerally what the experience was. And he also gave me acupuncture while I was there. And it really, it's
fantastic.
So hopefully they will get that going again in Harlem. I'm not sure what's happening now today with COVID, but I can imagine that service is, people are really, it's such a powerful.
Yeah. Mia, thank you for taking up this charge. Thank you for writing so large some of the very critical issues in this area of medicine, in this area of public health. Thank you for telling Matulu's story and the story of those incredible pioneers. Thank you. Thank you for the great conversation, and thanks to the Denver Film Festival. And thank you, audience, for watching the film. Thank you, audience. Thank you so much for watching the film.